There is a growing awareness among educators that games can be useful if they can be aligned with specific learning goals, especially games that are designed with educational goals in mind. Practically speaking, though, there's very little guidance for game developers in terms of balancing learning goals and the need to make a game fun to play. This presentation outlines a framework combining instructional design theory and game design theory that can be used to develop educational games that are both fun to play and educational. The use of games in the classroom is definitely growing. As game creation tools become more sophisticated, it becomes possible for almost anyone to create learning games. However, many learning games have come to be known as chocolate-covered broccoli, which describes a game that rewards boring learning drills with fun gameplay, but doesn't integrate the two styles of play. Many drill and practice games fall into this category. Ideally, someone designing a game, whether a commercial game developer or a classroom teacher creating games for students, should have an understanding of both instructional design and game design, or they'll end up designing games where there's no integration between learning and gameplay. For example, simply presenting players with an interactive learning module and rewarding right answers with a fun activity that's unconnected to the learning is not a good learning experience. Another common example of this is a game where players are immersed in a world that's based on the learning content, inside the human body, transported back in time to a historical event, but don't need to learn anything about that world in order to do well in the game. For example, if you play a doctor whose job is to heal patients, but you win by collecting healing power or medicine bottles instead of using medical knowledge, this is not a good learning game. Educational game designers need to focus on integrating learning goals with the game fantasy and game goals in order to create what's called an intrinsic learning experience for players. An intrinsic game is made up of learning activities that are seamlessly integrated into the game narrative, while extrinsic games have activities with only a shallow connection or no connection at all to the game fantasy. An extrinsic game that most of us are familiar with is Jeopardy! Any content can be used in the game, and the game itself does not change. An intrinsic game you may have read about is Civilization. This is a game where players learn about the systems that affect how a country develops. In a sense, extrinsic games are better at testing things students should already know, while intrinsic games are better at teaching content. There is a growing demand for games that can teach rather than test. Game mechanics are those actions a player can use to interact with the game. For example, jumping, shooting, climbing, and talking are all things that a player can traditionally do in a game. These are the skills a player masters by dealing with the various challenges they face in a game, like searching for a hidden object or fighting enemies. In an intrinsic game, these skills should be things a player has to master in order to learn the desired content. As in any instructional design project, a learning game designer should start by defining the learning goals. The next step is to brainstorm possible game mechanics, such as jumping, throwing, collecting, grouping items, growing or shrinking objects, building, anything that can be connected to the learning goals. For example, a designer might pair the game mechanic duplicating with the learning goal multiplication. After pairing several game mechanics with the defined learning goals, the designer can then design a game scenario and game world that are a natural extension of those mechanics. To guide this process in a way that keeps both instructional design and game design needs at the forefront of the design process, I've created a design framework called the Game Model of Educational Game Design. GAME stands for Goals, Activities, Mechanics, Environment, the 4 steps that are required for this method of game development. These 4 steps are listed in order of importance. However, keep in mind that since design is an iterative process, this is not a linear technique. This is also not a recipe where you can just follow the steps and create a perfect game. It's just a framework to guide your thinking through the process and provide some checks and balances. Goals. Define your learning goals for the game. Make sure to break this list down as far as possible to include any sub-goals that players have along the way. There are 4 steps to defining learning goals for a game, which can be remembered by the acronym DATA. DATA stands for Determine Instructional Needs, Analyze the Learners, Task Analysis, and Assessment Analysis. Determine Instructional Needs. What instructional need will this game fill? What skill will players have after mastering this game that they currently don't? For example, this game will provide 2nd and 3rd grade students practice with learning the multiplication table. Analyze the learners. Who is the target audience? Where will they be playing? Alone, in a group, at home, in a classroom? Do they have any special learning characteristics or conditions that we need to take into account? Task analysis. What tasks will players have to perform in order to master the learning objectives? Break this down as much as possible into all the subtasks that are involved in each target skill. Assessment analysis. How will we know when players have mastered the target skills? What should they be able to do once they've mastered those skills? These will be mapped to in-game goals to measure player progress. And those are the 4 steps of defining goals. The next step in the process is activities. Identify learning activities that support the learning goals. These are things that you would do with students in a classroom. Map these to equivalent game activities that can be used to create gameplay that's based on the learning objectives. For example, students should be able to produce multiples of a given number. In the game, players will create potions of different strengths by using multiples of a given number. Mechanics. Choose gameplay mechanics the player can use to perform the game activities. You should include enough mechanics that gameplay does not become repetitive and boring, but not too many that the player has trouble keeping track of them. Players should spend their energies learning the game content, not figuring out how to play the game. This component should be designed using the MDA, Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics framework, created to aid in balancing game design. This framework was developed to bridge the gap between game research and practical game design and provide guidelines for managing the balance between mechanics, the ways in which players interact with the game, dynamics, the game scenarios that arise as a result of the mechanics, and aesthetics, the emotions the player feels as a result of game dynamics. I will not be analyzing this framework in depth since it is beyond the scope of this presentation and there is existing literature that gives more information. Environment. Design a game environment that supports the chosen mechanics. This involves creating a game fantasy and narrative, for example, futuristic Wild West, and player has to outsmart local thieves to collect enough resources to travel through town and discover the hidden gems that will power the broken spaceship. The game narrative establishes the short-term and long-term game goals and drives the individual challenges that face the player. The fantasy should support creation of engaging gameplay scenarios, and the narrative should place learning content within the game context. Learning challenges that the player faces within the game should feel like a natural extension of the game, not an obstacle within it. If a player has to cross a river, they should be able to make a bridge from objects they would expect to find in the game scenario. The learning goals should drive the rest of the process. The content of the learning should be designed around the goals, and game activities appropriate to the content are then developed. The fantasy environment is created to fit the game activities so that the learning is a natural outcome of playing the game. It's important to keep in mind that this is not a linear process. To keep the balance between all the steps, the designer has to constantly evaluate and adjust and playtest each part of the game to make sure the final product feels satisfying to the player. The ideas in this presentation are based on research done by leading game developers in the field and synthesized into a practical framework. The next step is to put this to the test by designing a game using this framework and testing how useful the game is for learning the desired content and how students rate it in terms of being fun to play. Hopefully, student and teacher feedback will allow me to further refine this framework so others can use it for their own work.